For people unfamiliar with you, please just tell us your name, a bit about your background, and really what you've been up to for the last 30, 40 years.
I'm James Hansen. I'm now retired from NASA. I was a director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies for 32 years. I'm now at Columbia University, where I'm the director of Climate Science Awareness and Solutions, which is a program aimed at understanding climate change and informing the public and trying to influence policies. My scientific background, I started out in astronomy, wrote a master's thesis on the eclipse of the moon, and wrote my Ph.D. thesis on Venus, on why is Venus so hot, which of course turns out to be that it has a lot of carbon dioxide. And that caused me to get interested in the Earth because we have a planet in which the atmospheric composition is changing before our eyes. So it makes the Earth a more interesting planet than Venus or the others because people live on this one. So I resigned as a principal. I actually had proposed an experiment to go to Venus, which was accepted. Furthermore, we proposed an experiment to go to Jupiter on the Galileo mission, and that was accepted also. Well, my two friends took over. Actually, Larry Travis took over the Pioneer Venus experiment and Andy Lasis Galileo experiment. And I worked full-time on trying to develop a computer model for the Earth's climate to study the likely effects of the changing atmospheric composition.
Guy McPherson is very pessimistic about humans surviving even 10 more years on the planet. What do you think?
I think that's crazy. You can't kill people that easily, but there is real reason to be concerned about the long time scale. The biggest threats are, I think, the danger of large sea level rise. And we established most of our large cities on the coastlines. So if we continue to warm up the ocean such that it melts the ice shelves and causes many meter sea level rise, we will lose functionality of all those coastal cities, and the consequences would be enormous. And at the same time, we're also beginning to make the low latitudes uncomfortable, which is going to create a pressure for migration out of those latitudes. The planet could become ungovernable if we let those things go on. So I think we really should be concerned about the future of the planet on the time scale of today's young people. So I don't think that in 5 or 10 years we're humanity is going to be leaving the planet. But I do think we have a huge threat. And it's kind of a crazy situation because the truth is we could actually deal with this in a way that would be economically sensible. And if we make the price of fossil fuels honest, gradually, it would force us in the direction of clean energies. And everybody would be better off. You know, we're killing 20,000 people a day from pollution, indoor and outdoor pollution, contributing about equally. And that's from our dirty fuels. We need to move to clean energy. And the way to do that is to have a gradually increasing fee or tax on the energy sources that are a problem. You have to do it gradually because you don't want to have a big economic disruption. But if you do it gradually, it in fact spurs the economy. It causes entrepreneurs to try to make money. They want to come up with the clean energies. So it's a solvable problem, but our politicians are not doing it. I thought, the United States is is a bad actor, where we have the fossil fuel industry has too much power and they've bought our government. Well, so I went to more than a dozen countries, and it's not that different in other countries where fossil fuel industry is very powerful. That's what young people need to understand, that they have to influence this political system if they want to have a future. And it's something that they can do. They've proved that in recent elections in the United States. The young people had a huge impact on who was elected. But they did not demand the actions that are needed to assure their future. And that's partly because they didn't understand it, I think. They need to not let politicians get away with just marginal little actions which have little impact on the global story. You know, we've had these big international agreements, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, but then you make a graph of the global emissions, they keep going up. You know, so these agreements are nice pieces of paper, but they're not really changing our almost total dependence on fossil fuels for our energy.
If there was unlimited money and total cooperation between countries, what technologies, solutions, or products exist to reverse climate change or take greenhouse gases out of the environment?
Well, you know, the question of which technologies should be used to take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, that's a question which should be answered by the allowing the alternatives to compete, rather than politicians making the choice, rather than the public making the choice. The public will make the choice by means of what they buy. You know, if you put a price on carbon, then products that use a lot of carbon, a lot of fossil fuels, will become relatively more expensive. And we will move then to alternatives. But to choose beforehand which technology is the winning one is a bad idea, because you may choose something which is not the optimum solution. It's very hard to guess beforehand what is the best solution.
Why aren't the scientists talking about this more and taking more aggressive action?
Yeah, well, scientists are talking about the science. What my problem with the scientists is that we haven't made clear enough the urgency of the issue. And we kind of understand each other, but I'm not sure the public understands us, especially the fact that we could deal with the issue, but we're not. You know, so we you know, the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, puts out these reports every 5 or 6 or 7 years. They're very detailed, complicated scientific reports, but we need to really tell the public, you know, oh, we're not solving the problem. So they make new scenarios, for example. And now they're making scenarios in order to keep the climate from going haywire. They're putting in negative emissions, huge amount of negative emissions. Well, what does that mean? That means you have to suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's possible, but it takes energy to do that. And it's a little unlikely that we can do it at the scale that would be needed. So we need to, instead of just adding more scenarios with some unrealistic aspects to them, we need to say, whoa, you know, we're going too far. We've got to make some dramatic changes in our energy sources. And I'm just I'm not sure that we have sufficiently clearly warned the public about just how difficult this problem is. The reason it's so difficult is because of the delayed response of the system. So the public doesn't see that much happening. They're beginning to see, okay, it does look like we're getting more of these events, unusual storms and unusual floods, a 100-year flood occurring more than once a century. And sea level is beginning to rise, but so far, okay, Miami's getting a little bit of water on their streets, but the problem is that's just the beginning. And because of the delayed response, we're building in a much bigger response for today's young people. And that's the kind of problem which is difficult to solve, because people don't want to address a problem until they can see that it's real. Now we're at the edge. We're beginning to see that it's real. And so this is the time that we had better get active and actually move toward clean energies in a very major way, not the marginal few percent that we're doing now.
You mentioned the IPCC. Why aren't they talking about this even more and taking even more aggressive action, if you agree with that they should be?
Well, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is not charged with taking actions. They're charged with informing the governments about the status of our knowledge of climate change and even scenarios, what would be the effect of alternative scenarios in the future. The actions need to be taken by the governments. Now, scientists have a big responsibility to make sure the governments understand what's happening and understand the fact that the system is a very dangerous one because of its delayed response and the fact that the climate system has amplifying feedbacks. So that means there's the danger of losing control of the system, and we really need to make sure that the policymakers understand that. I think that IPCC has done a reasonably good job of doing that. Their reports are huge and not always in a language that the layperson or the politician can easily understand, but eventually the implications do come out, but we're just not getting government actions in response to the warnings that have now become quite clear. And I think perhaps we scientists should be a little more vocal in letting the public know that the governments are not doing practically anything to really make a difference. But nevertheless, I would put the major burden is on the governments. But then, in turn, if the governments are not doing their job, then the public has got to understand this and use the democratic process to try to alter the policies. And we're at a point where maybe that will begin to happen. Finally, just very recently, some young people have protested, staying home from school, demonstrating in some of the capitals around the world. So maybe we're on the verge of putting enough pressure on governments to actually get some action, but that remains to be seen.
Tell me how you see the next 30 years going if nothing changes in the way the world produces greenhouse gases.
Well, how will things go if we have 30 more years of business as usual? Then what would happen is we would lock in dramatic changes. We've already locked in additional change just because of the inertia of the system, the fact that there's a delayed response, the fact that the planet is out of energy balance. There's more energy coming in from the sun than there is heat radiated to space. So that means that more warming of the ocean is locked in, and climate consequences of that are locked in. But if we do 30 more years of business as usual, the amount that will be locked in is so great that the consequences would be much more severe than if we would begin to take action soon. I think that it's still possible to avoid multimeter sea level rise. But if we go 30 more years with business as usual, I don't see how you could do that, because we're already at more than 1 degree global warming. And we've got locked in several tenths of a degree additional, so that sort of the best that's possible, if we really got going right now, would be to have a maximum of the order of 1.5 degrees Celsius. But if you go another 30 years, then you're talking, 2.5 or 3 degrees locked in, and that makes it much warmer than the Eemian. The Eemian was the last prior interglacial period. We have already increased temperature outside the range of the Holocene, which is the current interglacial period that has existed for more than 10,000 years and which civilization developed in, because it was a stable climate. Sea level became stable, and we could establish cities, and civilization developed in that period. But if you go back to the Eemian, it was about a degree warmer, and sea level was 6 to 9 meters higher, which is 20 to 30 feet. That we can't set in motion processes that will take us there, because then sea level, it would not immediately go to such high level, but it would start rising and it would be unstoppable. And so our coastal cities would be doomed. And so we can't pass that point where the ice sheets are certain to go unstable. It's hard to say how fast they can go unstable. In our paper a couple years ago, we concluded that if you stay on business as usual, it could be as fast as 50 to 150 years. In fact, we argue that it would be that fast that you would get to multimeter sea level rise. So we don't want to do that. That's, I think, the biggest threat. But there are numerous other impacts, because civilization adapted to the stable climate of the Holocene, and we're now leaving that period because of the human effects.
What are the very most powerful 5 action steps we could take immediately to stop climate change?
Well, the 5 most effective immediate steps, I would say by far the most important step is putting a rising price on carbon. But that phrase is used now by politicians around the world, and you have to be very careful in parsing what they really mean by that, because a price, some of them, they talk about different gimmicks, different ideas of how we will try to increase the price of fossil fuels. Well, you actually want to do it in a way that promotes carbon-free energies and does it in a way which actually spurs the economy. So if you simply put a tax on fossil fuels, well, it's very hard to make that global, and it's very hard to get the public to accept it. The public doesn't want to pay more for gasoline at the pump. So what I've argued now for more than a dozen years is to put a fee on carbon, which you collect from the fossil fuel companies, but you distribute the money to the public, an equal amount to all legal residents. Then it turns out, if you look at the current distribution of fossil fuel use, 70% of the people would actually come out ahead. And mostly low-income people would tend to come out ahead because they have a smaller carbon footprint than wealthy people who travel more and who have bigger houses and don't pay attention that much to their carbon footprint. But in order to stay on the good side, you have to begin to pay attention, not so much, I mean, there are certain big ticket items like a vehicle. You'd better buy a more efficient one the next time you get a new vehicle. But mainly it's just paying attention to the price of things on the shelf, because those things that use more fossil fuels in their production will become more expensive. So you don't even need to think about it. It's something that will happen automatically. And the economists have studied this and shown that if you take a $10 a ton fee on carbon, collect that from fossil fuel companies, and let it go up $10 a ton each year for 10 years, after 10 years, it's $100 a ton. It increases the price of gasoline at the pump by $1 a gallon, but it gives a couple $1,000s a year to each legal resident. So most people would come out ahead. And that rate of increase reduces U.S. emissions 30% in 10 years, which is much more than you can get by means of regulations or begging people to, let the economy affect people's energy choices. That's the way to get the fastest action. And that's the way that you can get an international approach, because it's just a single number, the carbon fee, or you can call it a carbon tax. If China wants to collect it as a tax, that's fine. They don't have a democracy, and they could get away with that. But in any case, it's a single number, and it's a way that you can make it international, because if a country chooses not to have that, then the United States would put a border duty on products from the country representing the effect of the fossil fuels on the production of that product. It's a well-established activity which can be done at the border, and that encourages all countries to have their own carbon fee so they can collect the money themselves rather than have us collect it at the border. And the economists agree that this would work. It's just has not been done yet. The list of 5 most effective actions, the carbon fee is the underlying thing, because that's what makes the others possible. Now, we do need carbon-free energy sources, especially for electricity. If we can get carbon-free electricity, then we can solve the problem. There are other things. Transportation, it may be difficult to make that totally electric, so we may need some other developments. It's hard to believe that in a country like the United States, for example, that we will go totally electric for all of our vehicles just because of the range restriction that puts on the vehicles, unless we come up with even better batteries, and it's just physically a difficult thing to do. So we may need a liquid fuel to replace gasoline, and there are different possibilities for that. Hydrogen is one of them. But those alternatives should be allowed to compete with electric, and as long as the price of carbon goes up, then the fossil fuels will have a harder and harder time, and the other alternatives will, will compete against that. I think that we made a big mistake in the United States by effectively giving up on nuclear power several decades ago and just sticking with this old light water technology that was developed 50 years ago, partly based on the preference of the military people. But there are many ideas for how you could do nuclear power much more efficiently and using most of the fuel instead of less than 0.1% of the fuel. So I think that we should support the research and development of that kind of long lead engineering development that's needed. We still have the best innovative potential in the United States and the best universities and in particular even in nuclear technology. But they're just not supported at a level that would allow rapid progress in a commercial development of commercial reactors. So I think that is something that deserves attention.
So nuclear power could be one of the keys to eradicating climate change.
Yeah, I think it was always assumed that we were moving first from wood and then coal and then oil and then gas. And then the next logical step was nuclear in the sense of more and more condensed form of the fuel and more convenient form. Even back in the 1950s, environmentalists thought, nuclear looks like it's better than some of renewables because renewables take up so much space and have every energy source has some problems. But partly based on the belief that, maybe we don't want abundant clean energy because then population increases and people overrun the planet. Actually, abundant, affordable, clean energy is actually our best chance of controlling population, I think, because in the countries where abundant energy has been available, and countries have become wealthier, then the population fertility rate has declined, so I don't think that was actually a legitimate fear. But in any event, I think we need alternatives, and so that's one that should be allowed to compete. We shouldn't have. We've put in so much R&D into renewables, and that's worked very well. The price of solar power and wind power has come down dramatically because of all of that subsidies and R&D. But we have not done the same with nuclear power, so it's been kind of stuck on old technology. I think that was a mistake.
Richard Oppenlander and others say the most powerful thing we can do to stop climate change is stop eating animal products. Is this true? And if so, aren't more people speaking about this? Or why aren't more people speaking about this?
Well, I think a lot of people do actually speak about the fact that a meat-based diet has a very heavy footprint on the planet. And that's why there's been so much encouragement of going vegetarian or vegan. On a personal basis, that is probably the single thing that you can do that would decrease the size of your footprint the most. And so that's fine, but that's not going to stop the use of fossil fuels. So we do need to influence the politics as long as we're not making fossil fuels pay their cost to society and in fact subsidizing them, then we can't solve the problem. And our individual actions, even changing our diet in the most extreme ways, is not going to solve the problem. So those things can be encouraged, but that's not enough.
What proof do you have for people that say climate change is natural?
Well, climate change is natural. And that's actually what informs us. You know, we can use those natural variations to understand how big a change you will get for a given change of the forcing factors. The climate of Earth has changed enormously over time, associated with, primarily with, the change of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So, and there are other forcing factors that can change the climate, and they're very useful. Large volcanoes, for example, reduce the amount of sunlight coming in, and they cause a cooling. And we're able to test our climate models by using these natural experiments. And what they tell us is that the climate system is very sensitive. And now humans have become the biggest forcing factor. We can now measure, we measure very accurately how CO2 is changing, how methane is changing, and we can measure how the sun is changing. There's a solar cycle. The sun becomes brighter and dimmer with a 11-year cycle, and it may have longer-term variations also. But that's how we understand, by using these natural variations. That helps us understand the system and check our models and compare the natural changes with the human-caused ones. And humans have become, by far, the biggest source of change.
What are the results of climate change so far in terms of its impact on melting ice caps or glaciers, and why does that matter?
Well, the effect of climate on ice, on glaciers, on ice sheets, on snow, and on permafrost is now very apparent. And we can see in the glaciers, for example, Glacier National Park, within a few decades will have very little ice, if any. It will become a misnomer. Switzerland, the famous glaciers there are receding rapidly. So there's no doubt about what's happening. And we see permafrost, beginning to melt at the southern borders of the frozen ground region in Canada and Alaska and Siberia. And most dangerous and most concerning is the change on the ice sheets on Greenland and especially Antarctica, where the ice sheets are losing mass. And there are two effects of global warming on the ice sheets. One is you get more snowfall, so they grow faster in the center. But we get more melting around the edges. Well, we now have, so there had been some puzzlement about, what's going to be the net effect of those two things? Common sense would tell you if the planet gets warmer, then probably the ice sheets are going to get smaller. But the time scale of that may not we're changing the climate so fast that it could, conceivable if the ice sheets are very stiff, that increased snowfall is actually going to allow them to grow. And some people actually thought that. Well, now we have the answer. Because of this remarkable little satellite, a pair of satellites called the gravity satellite, which can measure the Earth's gravitational field so precisely that you can see the change of the mass of the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet. And what we see is that they're both shrinking. They're now shrinking at a rate of a few hundred gigatons, billion tons of ice per year, which is sounds like a lot. It's enough to cause so that sea level, all the processes together are causing sea level to rise about a little more than 3 millimeters a year, which is not negligible, but is not yet a big practical problem. It has caused a sea level rise of about a foot over the last century. But that's the real issue is what is going to be the change in the future. And the rate of melting keeps increasing. So that is the big threat. That's why we need to reduce emissions to avoid instability and sea level rise of many meters.
What are the results of climate change so far in terms of its impact on ocean acidification, and why does that matter?
Well, the change of ocean acidification is not a climate change, it's a change due to the carbon dioxide. So it has the same source as the climate change, the increasing CO2 in the atmosphere. Much of it, about a third of it, is going into the ocean, where it's carbonic acid. It increases the acidification of the ocean, and that, combined with the rising temperature in the upper layers of the ocean, is having an effect on the biology of the ocean, and especially the coral reefs, which are being stressed by those two factors, the rising temperature and the acidification, and other things that humans are doing, so that we are losing coral reefs at a pretty rapid rate. And we don't want that to happen because there are so many species, millions of species associated with the coral reefs. They're the rainforest of the ocean. And so we need to preserve them, and we can. If we bring the emissions under control so the temperature stabilizes, then we can still save these remarkable parts of our natural system. So we don't want to leave the impression of this is gloom and doom, that we're necessarily going to be losing these things, because that's not essential. But we do have to change our energy path if we want to preserve them.
What are the results of climate change so far in terms of its impact on temperature, and why does that matter?
Yeah, the temperature is already increasing at an unprecedented rate. You know, the global temperature has increased more than 1 degree Celsius over the last century, which makes the temperature today warmer than the planet, warmer than it has been in the Holocene, which is the past 10,000 years. In fact, we're at least half a degree above the prior maximum in the Holocene. So that implies you leave this temperature in place indefinitely, and it's going to cause some long-term changes, including sea level and shifting of climate zones. But the real threat is how much more it's going to increase. if we're already with the temperature rise of a little more than 1 degree Celsius in the last century, we're approximately at the temperature of the Eemian, which 120,000 years ago. And that is threatening because of the fact that sea level was 20 to 30 feet higher at that time. So we really need to actually draw down some of the CO2 out of the atmosphere if we want to avoid still additional warming, because the planet is now out of energy balance, so the 1 degree warming, 2 degree Fahrenheit warming is actually going to increase if we just leave the atmosphere at its present composition. So we actually need to get it to decrease. And that's possible because the ocean is taking up CO2. If we would stop emissions, then the amount of CO2 in the air would decrease fairly rapidly because it goes into the ocean. But you have to stop the emissions if you want the CO2 to decrease.
What are the results of climate change so far in terms of its impact on extinction of other species, and why does that matter?
Well, we know from the Earth's history that climate change can affect species and even drive species to extinction. The reason that the current climate change, if it continues, is a particular threat to species is the rate of change of global temperature is now at least 10 times faster than any known change in the past. The rise so far is still moderate, about 1 degree Celsius, but if we continue that rate, it's going to affect species because any given species can only live within a certain climatic zone. And unlike humans, they don't have air conditioners. So they will have to try to move to stay within their climate zone. In some cases, that becomes not possible. For example, a species on a mountain, if the temperature moving up the peak, the animal gets to the top of the mountain and there's no place to go. So we threaten the existence of a significant fraction of the species on the planet if we stay on business as usual. So far, the stresses on different species have been, I think, more for other reasons as humans essentially take over the planet. But when you combine those stresses with rapidly shifting climate zones, then there is the threat that you can drive species to extinction, and that's an irreversible process. So that's the reason, that's one of the many reasons that we want to slow down emissions and stabilize atmospheric composition.
How much time do we have before climate change makes growing food and living on the planet just too difficult?
How much time do we have before climate change makes the planet practically uninhabitable or very difficult to live on? Well, we're beginning to see impacts now. So it depends on where you are. We're very close if you happen to be living on a South Sea island, which is not far above sea level. So for some people, we're almost there. So it depends, but the best way that I have found to try to quantify the issue is relating to sea level, because we established most of our cities on coastlines. It was for practical reasons, commerce. We communicated among countries by ships, but also because the coastlines are biologically rich. The fish resources there is a very good source of protein and food. And so we established our infrastructure. A large fraction of our infrastructure is on coastlines. So that is what I think establishes the lowest level of a really big threat. And the problem is that we realize that threat, we're very close to locking in unacceptable consequences for coastal regions and therefore for the future of young people and their children and grandchildren. Hopefully, this will sink in to global politicians, and we will get, over the next several years, we'll begin to move emissions down and move to clean energies, because it's still possible. But if we stay a few more decades on business as usual, then I think it's impossible to avoid loss of global coastal cities.
What happens when you explain this information to world leaders? Do they listen? Do they believe you? Do they care?
Well, world leaders now, most of them, say the right words with regard to recognizing the reality of the climate threat. They like the word existential, that it's an existential threat. But their actions in response to that knowledge are not commensurate. They're not taking the actions which actually will cause global emissions to begin to decline rapidly. And it's a tragedy because of the fact that those actions, the purported reason for not taking the actions is, well, it would be expensive. It's not really true. If you do it in a smart way, it's actually, economies are more efficient if the prices are honest. So if you make the price of fossil fuels include their cost to society, and you do it gradually so that you don't get a sudden depression, then it actually doesn't cost you anything. It's actually economically beneficial and can increase your gross domestic product. So that's what is frustrating about the situation, that the actions actually make sense. The needed actions make sense, except to the small number of people who are getting very wealthy off of our addiction to fossil fuels. And they do a good job of bribing our governments not to take the needed actions. That's where young people need to really get angry and pressure the government to look after their future.
At the end of the day, it's always about the dollar.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's about the dollar, except it should, and there's nothing wrong with that if you're talking about the dollar for everybody. The standard of living of the public has been raised by fossil fuels. Energy is needed to support the lifestyles that people want. People like to travel, for example, and that's fine. But we need to do it in ways that don't harm young people and future generations. And we're finally beginning to understand that. And so we need to get policies that will achieve the desire to continue to have the lifestyles and the economic benefits of plentiful energy, but to do it in ways that don't punish young people and their children and grandchildren.
What are the results of climate change so far in terms of impact on water shortages, and why does that matter?
overall effect of climate change on the water cycle is pretty simple. What happens is the dry regions get drier and the wet regions get wetter. And partly also just as a function of time at a given place. The times when you get rainfall, you will tend to get heavier rainfall, and droughts will become more extreme. And the reasons are pretty simple. The higher temperature, when you do have dry periods, will cause it to be hotter and evaporate more, and your drought will be more extreme. But rainfall, times and places where you get it, can be heavier and more damaging as well as beneficial because the atmosphere holds more water vapor when it's warmer. So we see that the 100-year flood is occurring more than once a century now. And the damaging floods are more damaging. So that's a pretty straightforward effect, and it's now reached the point where it's statistically there, and people notice that things are just not the way they used to be.
Is it because of these greater water vapors that are in the air now that we see, or at least feel, that our hurricanes are larger or more damaging?
Okay, the increased water vapor in the atmosphere also affects storms. Those storms that are driven by latent heat of water vapor. And that includes tropical storms, tornadoes, and thunderstorms. It doesn't mean that every storm is going to be powerful, but there's the potential for that, along with the warmer ocean surface, which provides the fuel for hurricanes and typhoons. So statistically, you expect to see an effect, and you expect to see the potential for the strongest storms. And there is evidence that that is, in fact, beginning to happen.
What are the results of climate change so far in terms of its impact on food shortages, and why does this matter?
Well, if climate affects food production, obviously that matters because much of the world is in a state of where they have marginal food supplies. Climate is shifting. Climate zones are shifting. So, and in particular in Africa, we can see regions that are becoming more drought prone, and there's a lot of impact, even starvation in certain regions as a result of that. So it is an issue. Our technologies have improved to the point where we can grow more food on a given area, and so we still have the ability to grow enough food to feed the world's population, but it's a question of the distribution of that, and people live where they've lived for centuries, and if the climate zones shift and if you have national boundaries, they can't move so easily. So that's a problem. One of the many reasons that you want climate zones not to be shifting, not only for humans but for the other species on the planet. It causes a lot of problems if the changes are so large and so fast that it alters the places on the planet that you can grow food and have a hospitable climate. So it's a potential problem, and that's related to the rate of change. That's why we want to slow down the emissions and slow down the rate of climate change.
Do you think the media is covering this as much as they should be, or should they be doing it more? Are they covering it appropriately?
The media is probably not done as well as we would hope in reporting climate change. And that's partly because of the way the media has changed over the last few decades. If you go back a few decades, the newspapers and the other media had more people, had more good people, science reporters, who could translate what scientists are often not very good at making clear, so that the public could understand it. I would say in just the last few years that maybe there has been some improvement. There has been some real effort to accurately inform the public, but at the same time we have politicians now who completely deny. It's as if we no longer believe in science. We no longer believe in facts, that we can just invent our own interpretation. That's a little scary. Scientists used to be respected, and the scientific method is really crucial for making decisions, for making wise decisions. So it is an area of concern. I mean, we have in the United States, we have a National Academy of Sciences established by Abraham Lincoln for the purpose of helping the government make wise decisions. We're not really utilizing them. That is a shame, a tragedy, actually, if we continue to not take advantage of the capability that we have. And so media is part of the issue. We need to do a better job of informing the public, because the public is not as knowledgeable as they could be. I still think I put more of the blame on the politicians than on the public, because the public does pretty much make clear, and the public, a majority does affect does agree on the reality of climate change, and they want to see government policies. But our politicians are heavily influenced by special interests, and the public knows this. That's why they're fed up with both political parties. The public really understands that there is now climate change and that humans are a part of that. And they would like to see the government have policies that help assure the future of the young people and future generations. But the politicians are not taking the actions yet that are needed. And I think that's largely because of the huge influence of money in Washington, of special interests, and the fossil fuel industry in particular is basically buying our congresspeople. That's something that the media needs to report on better, and maybe that would help us change the situation.
What do you see as the importance of the Real Truth About Health conference, or being here at the Real Truth About Health conference?
Well, I think the importance of this conference, the Real Truth About Health conference, is that it's one way to get information to the public, because the public is going to have to affect the policies. The politicians, if they're not pressured, are going to continue to respond to the money, to the fossil fuel industry. So we've got to get the public well informed on this issue and do it in time for our young people and for their children.